What we have here is a picture of 4 biotic components. We learned earlier in the course that a biotic component is just a living organism within an ecosystem. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 living organisms or biotic components of an ecosystem. What's interesting about these particular biotic components is that they eat one another. And so what we have here is an example of a food chain. You probably recognize this food chain because it's one that we see nearby in northern Ontario. And as a result, this is called a forest ecosystem food chain. And really the purpose of a food chain is not only to show who eats who, where the ghost hawk eats the weasel, and the weasel eats the red squirrel, and the red squirrel eats the pine cone, but it also shows the flow of energy through the food chain. And the only living organism in this food chain that can actually create its own energy is the pine tree. And the red squirrel must eat the seeds of the pine cone to get its energy. But because the pine tree can make its own energy, it's given a specific name called producer. As you learned earlier in the course, these producers, which are essentially plants, can use a special process called photosynthesis. And the special process of photosynthesis uses the sun to make energy. Well, the energy that the tree actually makes is just sugar. And so when the red squirrel eats the pine cone, what it's getting from that pine cone is sugar for energy. And when the weasel eats the red squirrel, same thing. It's obtaining energy in the form of sugar. The sugar is in a specific molecule when it's made by a producer, and that is glucose. And us as humans, we depend upon glucose for energy, for thinking, for moving, for digesting food, for keeping ourselves warm, etc. These 3 biotic components, or living things, in the food chain cannot make their own food. And they depend upon the producer to get their glucose or their energy. So we call these living organisms consumers. Now, within the group of consumers, we can subclassify. This red squirrel only eats plants, and as a result, it is a consumer, which is given the name of herbivore. So it's just a specific kind of consumer. When we look at the weasel or the ghost hawk, they're only eating other consumers. And as a result, we call them carnivores. So like the herbivores, these carnivores too are consumers. They just don't eat plants.